Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're looking into a really monumental shift happening right now in the built environment. We're talking about how the spaces where we live, work, and play are completely transforming for a sustainable, resilient future. If you follow real estate, architecture, or even just environmental policy, you already know the stakes have literally never been higher. So let's just jump right in.
I want to hook you right out of the gate with a pretty big question. What is the single largest way to eliminate energy waste and save money in the built environment? It's a massive challenge, right? Because usually doing the right thing for the planet comes with a pretty hefty price tag. But in real estate, we actually have this unique opportunity to tackle both skyrocketing operating costs and climate impacts at the exact same time.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll define climate-ready real estate, unpack the building emissions problem, and look at the real-world climate risks. Then, we're going to pivot to the solutions, look at some real-world building applications, and finally, what the future holds.
Okay, kicking things off with Section 1. Let's define what actually makes a property climate-ready.
Basically, climate-ready real estate means developing, constructing, and managing properties so that they efficiently use resources, reduce emissions, and, this is key, withstand extreme weather. And what's really fascinating here is that it's not just about environmental outcomes, like, lowering your carbon footprint or cutting waste. It's equally about social outcomes. We're talking about designing mixed-use properties that support local businesses, give easy access to public transit, and just create overall healthier, more resilient spaces for communities.
Which brings us to Section 2, the building emissions problem. Why is real estate at the absolute center of this conversation? Let's take a look.
Get ready for a pretty staggering statistic. The building sector is responsible for roughly 40% of all global greenhouse gas emissions and 40% of worldwide raw material use. 40%! From giant commercial office towers down to our residential homes, every single asset has an energy profile that directly impacts our planet.
Now, to actually solve this 40% problem, we kind of have to split it into two distinct buckets. First up, we have operational carbon. This is exactly what it sounds like. The energy used every single day just to run the building. Heating it in the winter, cooling it in the summer, keeping the lights on. Then on the flip side, we have embodied carbon. This is the carbon emitted during the actual manufacturing of the building materials, transporting those materials to the site, and the construction process itself. The big takeaway, you literally cannot achieve true decarbonization unless you tackle both.
And you can really see how this plays out across a building's entire life cycle. Starting right at the beginning, embodied carbon enters the atmosphere before a building is even used, just from extracting raw materials and running factories. Then, in the middle, you have that operational phase which kicks in and lasts for, say, 50 to 100 years. Finally, at the very end of its life, even more embodied carbon is released during demolition and waste disposal. So a building's carbon footprint actually starts years before anyone even moves in, and it lingers long after they move out.
And if property owners ignore that footprint, well, they're looking at massive liabilities. That brings us to Section 3, real estate's climate risks.
The thing about real estate assets is they are, by definition, fixed in place. You obviously can't move a skyscraper out of the way when a hurricane approaches. This makes properties uniquely vulnerable to immediate physical threats. Think floods, wildfires, and urban heat stress. But honestly, the risks aren't just physical. They are heavily financial. We're seeing major transition risks, like inefficient buildings suddenly losing their market appeal. There are strict regulatory penalties popping up, like New York's Local Law 97, which actually fines large buildings if their carbon output is too high. And thanks to extreme weather, property insurance premiums are absolutely surging. They're expected to jump 22% globally by 2040.
All of this risk translates directly into cold, hard asset valuation. We are seeing a really widening gap in the market right now. On one hand, sustainable, certified buildings are commanding what's called a green premium. They're selling for up to 35% more, and they're attracting higher rental rates because, tenants want energy-efficient, clean spaces. But on the other hand, inefficient, high-carbon buildings are getting hit with a brown discount. They're seeing a 10 to 20% drop in value. So in today's market, ignoring sustainability literally devalues your property.
But hey, a zero-carbon, highly resilient building isn't just some sci-fi pipe dream. Let's move right into Section 4, strategies to cut carbon.
The absolute most successful properties start with what we call passive design strategies. The best way to think about this? It's like putting a really good winter coat on the building. If you use high levels of insulation in the roof and walls, use airtight construction to stop those annoying drafts, and install high-performance windows, like triple glazed or low-E glass, you naturally prevent major heat loss or gain.
The building basically stays comfortable all on its own, without having to constantly crank up artificial heating or cooling.
So once you have that great winter coat on the building, it's time to upgrade the engine. These are your active system upgrades. We're talking about swapping out those old clunky fossil fuel boilers for high-efficiency electric heat pumps. And get this, heat pumps are roughly 3 times more efficient than traditional gas boilers. It also means upgrading to LED lighting, adding smart HVAC controls, and throwing in some on-site renewable energy like solar panels. Because the building's coat is already doing so much of the work passively, these active systems just don't have to work nearly as hard.
And here is a perfect real-world example of how smart tech plays into this. By simply using demand-controlled ventilation, which basically means sensors only pump in fresh air when they detect people are actually in the room, a building can save anywhere from 7 to 44% on its HVAC energy. Think about that for a second. That is a massive operational cost saving from just one single smart upgrade.
So how does this all come together in the real world? Let's jump into Section 5, Real-World Building Solutions.
I absolutely love this quote from Carl Elefante, the former president of the American Institute of Architects. He said, "The greenest building is the one that is already built." It's so true because it can take decades for a brand new, highly efficient building to offset the immense carbon footprint created during its construction phase. Because of that, the most sustainable solution is often adaptive reuse, basically repurposing the structures we already have instead of just tearing them down.
A really perfect example of this is the Quake Quarter Tower over in Sydney, Australia. Instead of just demolishing an aging skyscraper, the developers actually kept over 65% of the original tower's columns, beams, and its core. By saving all of those materials and skipping the whole heavy demolition process, adaptive reuse projects like this one can produce up to 75% less embodied carbon than starting from scratch. And they still completely revitalize the space. It's a total win-win.
The Earth Policy Institute frames this whole concept perfectly. You take an older, inefficient building and you give it an energy retrofit to slash its energy use by, say, 20 to 50%. Then you shift its remaining energy needs entirely over to carbon-free electricity, like on-site solar, and presto, you suddenly have a zero-carbon operating building. No magic required, it is entirely technically feasible to do this today.
Which brings us to our final section, the future of real estate.
To summarize the blueprint going forward, here's what we need to do. First, target both operational and embodied carbon. Second, upgrade with passive and active strategies. Third, retrofit existing buildings instead of always building new. And fourth, capitalize on that green premium. Doing this successfully doesn't just save the planet, right? It protects your investment and helps you dodge the massive financial risks of the brown discount.
I want to leave you with a final thought to reflect on. Take a second and just look around the room you are in right now. How could your own living or working spaces be adapted for a climate-ready future? Are there passive or active upgrades you could implement today? Because the transition to a sustainable built environment isn't just about those giant corporate skyscrapers. It starts with the places we occupy every single day.